The French president has called for a war economy. I think it's at the heart of President Macron's vision. For me, it's clear that the strategy that we've adopted works. Who would we be to lecture Ukrainians on the importance of the regions like Crimea when we fought for Alsace-Lorraine? It's in our interest too to bring Ukraine, to bring them into the EU and NATO.
When?
Now, yes, it's a good question.
For years, France was seen in Ukraine as even pro-Russian state, which do not support the European integration and NATO integration of Ukraine. But during this war, everything has changed. And Paris has become the key capital supporting Ukraine, providing us weapons and political backing. And now, here in Kyiv, we have Benjamin Haddad, who is French MP and representative of the group of Friends of Ukraine. Hello, Benjamin. I'm happy to see you here in Kyiv, and it's not the first time you're here.
No, it's not the first time. My first time actually was during the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, where as a pro-European, I was very moved to see all these young people fighting for the European flag, fighting for a better future, democracy, and it convinced me that Ukraine belongs in Europe, and I've come many times since then.
These words are key for us. Ukraine belongs to Europe. But let's not hide the elephant in the room. France do not have an image of pro-European country here in Ukraine. I think there is a reason for that, which was formed by decades.
You know, I'm here today in Ukraine with a parliamentary delegation of 6 MPs from 6 different parties, some in the majority, others in the opposition, but all here to send a message of friendship and solidarity with the Ukrainian people in this time of war and aggression. The French overwhelmingly support Ukraine's accession to the EU and NATO, sanctions against Russia, weapons deliveries to Ukraine. And what's so interesting beyond this support is that the French public, like many others in Europe, are still very much interested and focused on this. I'll just give you one anecdote. We have a free 24-hour news channel in France, a little bit like in the US. One of the 3 has decided to shift to 24/7 coverage of Ukraine with a very positive coverage, and it's gone to #1 in the news. And same thing for magazines and headlines. By popularity, yes. And so people, you know, the French people really care. We've passed 3 resolutions of support for Ukraine. One resolution of support, one recognizing Holodomor as a genocide, calling the importance of the memory of the Ukrainian nation. One designating Wagner as a terrorist organization, and the French parliament with almost unanimous support. But to be blunt, I'll respond to your question though. It's true that I think for a long time, France was not interested enough in this region, didn't understand it enough. By the way, when I mean not only Ukraine, but even Central and Eastern Europe in general, I think we missed maybe an encounter since the end of the Cold War. And I'm very heartened to see now that there's much more engagement of France in Central and Eastern Europe and better empathy and understanding for the historical and geographical experience of the region.
How do you see, why did it happen? So we have witnessed France, which voted against Ukrainian membership action plan for NATO in 2008. We'll return to the NATO issue later. We had France, which was skeptical towards European integration of Ukraine, and now we have France, which has become really a friend of Ukraine. What has made this shift?
Well, I think for a long time, you know, France basically said we first have to focus on reforming the EU and integrating the EU before enlarging. And clearly there's been a major shift on February 24th, 2022, where we understand now that enlargement is also a geopolitical necessity for Europe. If you want to preserve peace and stability on the European continent, then you need to compete with Russia, but also with China and other external influences that we've seen. Because of course there's Ukraine, there's also Moldova, Georgia, the Western Balkans. So we need to be much better at competing, and here enlargement is a necessity. So we have to reform Europe and enlarge it at the same time in parallel. And I think clearly there was an awakening in France and all of Europe when we saw war on our continent again, that we need to rethink a lot of our intuitions.
Despite I was critical in my questions, I have to confess that indeed, in a process of acquiring candidate status, France has played not just significant, but a cornerstone role. Because without France, it would be hardly possible to form the coalition which have fully supported candidate status of Ukraine. So I beg your assessment that France wants to see Ukraine in the EU. But how do you see, when can it happen? When do you see a realistic timeline that Ukraine will be able to enjoy a membership status?
Yeah, so first, thank you for underlining this. Yes, France has been active in helping Ukraine get first candidacy status, and I do hope that we'll get to the next step later this year in opening accession talks. Victory will not only be about territorial gain, but it's also about making sure that Ukraine becomes a fully European nation. This is what Ukraine is fighting about. We talked about Maidan and the Revolution of Dignity. For the first time in history, we saw young people being targeted, being shot at because they were brandishing the European flag. And I think for many of us pro-European, it was an inspiration. And it's in our interest too, to bring Ukraine, to stabilize. Ukrainians right now are protecting the eastern flank of Europe, so to bring them into the EU and NATO.
When?
Now, yes, it's a good question. It depends also on you. I think it's a two-way process. It's a long process. It will take years. But I think some people are saying, oh, it's a long process because they don't want to see it happening. No, we have to make it a priority to accompany Ukraine in the reconstruction, in the reforms, and make this happen in the next few years. And then also prepare the EU in terms of its own internal functioning to make decision-making as swift as possible, to reform the structural funds, the agriculture policy. But I think we'll get there, and things have happened quicker than we thought in the last year, right? Look at the candidacy.
We have heard some dates already from some European politicians, and I understand that Charles Michel is not a representative of France, but he says that it is possible to have new accessions in 2030. Do you share that approach, that by this time it is really possible that both Ukraine and the EU would be ready for their new accession?
I want to be really blunt and say that I don't know. I don't know, I'll be frank, because I think for me, once again, it really depends on the progress that we both make, how we can help you Ukrainians accomplish the reforms. And once again, I am very impressed that the reforms are happening. So I do hope that we'll see Ukraine in the European Union as soon as possible. And I can tell you that France is committed to making that happen.
But there is one organization which is needed just to make Ukraine safe, which is NATO. And once we end up this war with our victory, we have to be in NATO. Now we don't see a NATO readiness for that. Invitation was strongly opposed by some countries in Vilnius.
France supports giving Ukraine a path to NATO. You mentioned Bucharest in 2008. And at the time, the reasoning by some countries, like France or Germany, for not giving Ukraine and Georgia membership action, was that it would be seen as a provocation for Russia, But what has happened in the meantime? Russia has attacked Georgia and then Ukraine in 2014 and 2022. Not inviting those countries was a provocation and was an invitation for aggression by Russia, because Russia saw it as weakness, saw it as Western countries not siding by Ukraine and Georgia. So it is clear that if we want to ensure long-term peace and stability and deterrence, we have to get Ukraine into NATO. Because what is Putin's gamble today? Clearly Putin underestimated the heroic resistance of Ukrainians. He overestimated his own army. He underestimated our own reaction and willingness to. But his gamble now is that we're going to lose focus. That there's a moment we're just going to stop being interested, we're going to divide, that national selfishness will take over. And so inviting Ukraine into NATO is a way to show also that we're in for the long run. So I think you have two steps now. The first step is what we can do right now in negotiating security guarantees. Some countries like the US and France, bilateral security guarantees to Ukraine, and making sure that, for example, the military support that we give continues and intensifies. And then I hope at the Washington summit, I was hoping that it would happen in Vilnius, but the Washington summit, that we give a clear invitation to Ukraine.
Do you think that it's reachable? The United States are still skeptical. How do you see, what is the way to convince Biden and his administration that Ukraine have to be invited to NATO now?
I think we have to continue to make the case. And I think it's really important for all Europeans to be united and make that case to the United States. Things have changed so much, right, in the last year. I mean, just the fact that we're talking about the invitation to NATO as something reachable and realistic shows already how fast things have moved. Initially, we said we shouldn't send tanks, but we ended up sending tanks. We shouldn't send planes, and now we see a momentum for this. So I think, this is where parliamentarians can play a role. This is where experts, civil society, think tanks can play a role in continuing to build a campaign for this.
Some people say that even European, not only American societies are afraid of invitation, because we, as those who deal with that, we know that invitation does not imply Article 5. It does not mean anything practical. It's a symbolic step. It's start of the process. But maybe for some people it means that, well, Ukraine is under NATO umbrella and, well, we have to protect it. Is there such kind of threat? Is there such kind of thinking in European societies, including French one?
It's interesting because my impression of France and European societies in general is that our public opinions tend to be much less cynical and much less afraid than our elites sometimes. So, you will have, if you watch French TV, you will have sometimes some intellectuals, some politicians, former prime ministers or heads of state saying, well, we have to find an arrangement with Russia, how far is this going, etc. But then when you talk to everyday people, for them it's very clear. There's an aggressor and there's a victim. And when you have a situation like this, you help the victim defend itself. And there's a very clear understanding also that this is a war that's happening in Europe at our doorstep. And so we have a responsibility to step up and to act. Now, I will say, though, that sometimes I'm a little worried about the political debate in the United States. We have Trump, who's very much ahead in the polls in the Republican primary. We have other candidates in the Republican primary.
Ramaswamy.
Ramaswamy or even DeSantis, who are questioning the support for Ukraine. I don't want to be too critical because I think the Biden administration has done a terrific job at supporting Ukraine and building a transatlantic unity in doing this. But, it reminds us that it's first and foremost our responsibility as Europeans. We need to step up. We need to increase our defense spending. That's something that we've all been doing in the last 2 years, Germany, France, Poland, and others. And we really need to send a signal that we're with Ukraine in the long run.
That's interesting that French society and other European societies has become more mature than elites of these countries, or maybe the reason is different. Maybe it's because some elites are still dependent from Russia?
Maybe some of this. We had a parliamentary investigative committee recently in France on foreign interference, and it showed, for example, that there's a clear connection between Russia and the far right in France, and that far right party, the National Front, got a loan, from Russia a few years ago to sustain its activities. We've seen the influence of Gazprom in Germany as well. So there's been a lot of this, and I think just sometimes misguided strategic thinking.
Regarding the war, I have a question that I ask to everyone, because I'm tired to hear a phrase which sounds from all the Western politicians that the victory is something that Ukrainians have to define. But Ukrainians has defined what they see a victory. Ukrainians, 90+%, stable, vast majority says that there is no space for any concessions. Ukraine is united, and during this war, Crimea has to return under Ukrainian control. Donbass have to return fully under Ukrainian control. Why don't we hear a clear statement supporting that from Western leaders? And can you say what you see as Ukrainian victory?
First, I do think we hear clear messages. The French position, and President Macron has been clear about this, is that we recognize Ukraine in its 1991 borders. There was a referendum at the time. All of the regions of Ukraine voted for independence and being part of the new state. President Macron was interviewed just recently in a magazine in France, and he compared Crimea to Alsace-Lorraine, the region that we had lost to Germany and that we regained after the First World War. And he said, who would we be to lecture Ukrainians on the importance of the regions like Crimea when we fought for Alsace-Lorraine? So, and you asked me about my definition of victory. As I said earlier, I think you have two things. Of course, you have territorial integrity and sovereignty. And then really, I think, giving Ukraine a clear path to Euro-Atlantic institutions. I think that's the thing that will really signal that Ukraine has won, that Russia has lost, is that Ukraine is now part of the European family forever.
We are afraid that some Western leaders, some Western countries want to trade with Russia, trade with Crimea status, NATO membership. Is that realistic?
No, I don't think so. I think we've seen, in the last few years when we've tried diplomacy with Putin, that it doesn't work. And it doesn't work for a simple reason, is that he's not interested in it. This is someone who for 20 years has built his regime in opposition to the West, in opposition to the EU, in opposition to the United States and NATO. And different presidents from Europe or from the United States, President Obama with the reset, for example, have tried a dialogue, have tried a transactional approach, and Putin is not interested. So right now, the best available option is to give Ukrainians the means to defend themselves and to regain their territory.
Is it realistic that Ukraine will also get French-made fighting jets?
I support giving Ukraine fighter jets. I'm frustrated that it took so long on the F-16. It's still taking a long time because, initially in the war, people said, well, it will take months to train the pilots, so we're not going to give F-16. Well, start training the pilots, and then you get the F-16. I think it would have been very helpful in the counteroffensive right now. For me, it's clear that the strategy that we've adopted works, which is we don't want NATO or European countries to get dragged directly into the confrontation, but then we give Ukrainians what they need to regain. So whether it's tanks or fighter jets, I support it. On a technical standpoint, I don't know if it's better to have French or other countries' fighter jets, but yes, I think Ukraine needs fighter jets. I really want us to accelerate the ammunition plan of the EU. I think it's extremely important, this plan that has set up Thierry Breton. Let's make sure that it works. 1 million ammunition in a year. That's something that Ukraine needs. That's something that we will need too. I mean, we need to ramp up our own defense production. The French president has called for a war economy because, the situation we've been facing for a year and a half shows that our industrial processes are not swift enough, are not quick enough to be able to respond to the needs of Ukrainians.
Are you ready for a situation which is really possible that next year, due to election campaign in the United States, we will have a significant decrease of support? That would mean that the EU and EU member states would have to take more burden. Are you ready for that?
Well, there's two things. First, I do think it would be misguided from the US. And you know what? I don't want to speculate because I think the Biden administration has been very strong and very steadfast from the start. A lot of us would want things to go quicker and be more ambitious, but
Congress.
But still, Congress, even Republicans in Congress so far, have signed on the help for Ukraine. I think it's important that it continues, and us Europeans will continue to make also that case to Congress and to the US. But to the second part of your question, down the road, after the election, if it doesn't go the way we hope, yes, I think Europeans need to really be ready to step up. We need to put ourselves in a situation where we can help Ukraine even on our own. We're not there yet. We're certainly not there yet. Is
there such understanding of this readiness in the elite of EU member states?
It's a good question. I think that clearly what's happening in US politics right now shows that those who thought in 2016 that it was an accident of history, that it was only a parenthesis of 4 years and we go back to normal, were wrong. Clearly something deeper is happening. The US society is changing. US priorities are shifting to Asia, to the rivalry with China. And American presidents, by the way, left and right, Barack Obama, like Donald Trump, have asked Europeans to spend more on defense, to take more ownership of their own security and defense. And it's legitimate. after all, I can't blame Americans for saying to Europeans, you have to be more self-reliant. So that's a message that we have to hear for ourselves and also for our relationship with America. I'm a big proponent of European defense, of European sovereignty, of giving ourselves the instrument to be able to compete in the world so that we can ensure security on our own, not against or without the US, as partners and allies to the US, but we have to be able to step up. I don't want Europe to just be a passive theater of great power rivalry between the United States and China. I want us to be a power. I want us to be able to compete with Russia and others on our own continent.
And you understand that Russia is definitely not the countries that you have to cooperate with.
Oh yes, absolutely. But look, we're talking about security issues, but look also on energy. For so long, people in Europe, in Germany, but not only, thought that energy trade with Russia would be sort of like a commodity that's traded on the market between customers and suppliers. No, it was a weapon. It's a political weapon that was used by Russia as a means of influence and leverage on our own democracy. So here again, we have to develop alternatives in terms of nuclear, in terms of renewables, different suppliers to be able to invest in our own sovereignty. I really hope, and at least that's what I'm advocating, that this is the end of naivete in Europe.
And President Macron shares you.
Yeah, I think it's at the heart of President Macron's vision. It's for Europe to step up, to be able to defend its own interest in security, on defense, on energy, on trade and technology, to be able to compete on the world stage. And clearly the first test for this is today in Ukraine.
Thank you very much for that interview. Thank you for that background, because it is needed to Ukrainian public to know. І дякую всім, хто додивився наше інтерв'ю. Лишайтеся з нами на каналі Європейської правди, каналі про Європу, НАТО та місце України у світі. До побачення.